Together for 3 years, yet Louis finds even a touch from me repulsive, while he's back in bed with his first love. I've become the laughingstock of all of B City. Everyone is waiting for me to beg him to make up. But this time, I didn't show up. Late at night, Louis rarely took the initiative to call me, only to hear a man's voice. He was furious. "If you dare touch her, I'll kill you." Sweat rolled down Joseph's chest as he spoke ambiguously. "She's really soft. I should thank you. After 3 years of being with you like a widow, her first kiss is still mine." Chapter 1. Louis, what's with the hickey on your neck? In the bar's private room, Louis's childhood friend pointed at his neck and asked, "I heard Tracy came back yesterday, and you picked her up at the airport. Could it be that you too?" "No way, isn't Louis known to be allergic to women?" "Yeah, he's been with Susie for 3 years, and her first kiss is still intact. It's pretty funny when you think about it. You guys just don't get it, huh? How can Susie compare to Tracy? Tracy is Louis's first love." Exactly. If Tracy hadn't decided to follow her older brother abroad back then, Susie wouldn't have stood a chance. I sat on the sofa, listening to their conversation, feeling like someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over me in the dead of winter, freezing my blood solid. That's when I noticed the dark purple hickey on Louis's neck, which stood out even more against his pale skin. He listened to their chatter with an indifferent expression and didn't deny anything. A sharp pain gripped my heart as I stared at that hickey, unable to snap out of it. "Shh, stop talking, Tracy's here." The private room door opened, and Tracy walked in, wearing a black, form-fitting slip dress. She was tall, slender, with wavy hair, stunningly beautiful. She was even more beautiful than in her photos. "Long time no see," Tracy greeted with a smile. Amidst the whistles, Louis stood up and extended his hand to her. She naturally placed her hand in his, then sat down next to him. Compared to me, she looked more like Louis's real girlfriend. "Tracy is getting more beautiful. Back home this time, are you planning to rekindle things with Louis?" She smiled. "Don't talk nonsense. I heard Louis already has a girlfriend here." "Don't mention it. You know Louis has some issues with physical contact, especially with women. That girlfriend of his has been with him for 3 years and hasn't even gotten a kiss, let alone anything else. But now that you're back." Tracy's face turned slightly red, and she glanced at Louis. "Who told you to tell them that?" Louis curled his lips. "I didn't say anything." "Is it true?" Tracy looked surprised and amused. "You and her really?" Louis didn't answer, his slightly cold gaze swept toward me. I looked pale, so embarrassed that I could barely hold the glass, the liquid inside spilling onto my dress. Tracy covered her mouth and fell into Louis's arms, laughing so hard she shook. "You're so mean," making her look so pitiful. I stood up and slowly wiped the stains on my dress with a tissue. Louis watched coldly. In this slow torture, the pain running through my chest turned into numbness, but I was gradually waking up. I had already paid off everything I owed Louis. Chapter 2. 3 years ago, Louis shielded my face during a car accident, but the shattered glass pierced through his right hand. He was born a painter, already famous at a young age, but because of this accident, he could never hold a brush again. During his most depressed period, the house was filled with empty liquor bottles, and he screamed at anyone who came near to get out. Tracy left him during that time. I was full of guilt, just wanting to know how I could make it up to him. At that time, his hands were covered in paint. Sitting in the middle of the mess, his beautiful face looked so bleak, as if no light could penetrate his eyes. "Make it up?" He curled his lips, a bit sarcastically. "I don't need anything, except for a woman." During these 3 years, he refused to do rehab, and I encouraged him to paint with his left hand, slowly regaining his confidence. Through daily practice, his technique even surpassed what it was before, creating works more stunning and exquisite than ever. Louis became more and more dependent on me day by day. Even though he had psychological barriers to physical contact, he insisted I stay within his sight while he painted. I understood his past and never forced him to be close to me. Several times, he held the back of my head, his eyes filled with desire as he slowly leaned in towards my lips, but stopped just before contact. The more he did this, the more it tickled my heart. Louis regained his fame, and it was at this time that he learned Tracy had returned. So, it wasn't that he didn't want to be physically intimate with a woman. It was just that the woman wasn't Tracy. 2 days ago, after dinner, I excused myself to go to the terrace for some fresh air. But I overheard Louis talking with his childhood friend. Tracy is coming back soon. What are you thinking? I heard she broke up with your brother. Louis lowered his eyes, extinguishing his cigarette. It's good that she's coming back. You still can't let her go? Yeah. Actually, Susie is pretty good too. When Tracy hurt you so badly that you couldn't even paint, it was Susie who stayed by your side and helped you pull through. She still doesn't know that your right hand didn't really damage the nerves, right? Chapter 3. I gathered myself, picked up my bag, and took out the key to Louis's house, placing it in front of him. Wow, our usually soft and gentle Susie is finally showing some backbone, huh? One of his friends had a look of amusement on his face. Louis frowned. What are you doing? I tossed the used tissue into the trash can. Louis, I have a cleanliness obsession. I once told you that once something has been used by someone else, I won't even look at it again. I meant it. His expression instantly darkened. He pressed his lips together, staring at me without saying a word. It's my fault, Tracy apologized, standing up to explain to me. We were both drunk last night, and I only found out today that he had a girlfriend. Otherwise, you don't need to explain so much to her. Louis's expression returned to indifference. Since you're back now, whether she's here or not doesn't matter anymore. He looked into my eyes and said slowly, after all, I never really liked her. Unfortunately, those words could no longer hurt me. I smiled faintly at him, and Louis's gaze grew sharper. As I was about to leave the room, I heard one of his friends ask, is Susie really just leaving like that? She used to be famous for being clingy, couldn't shake her off even if you tried. I think she just realized she can't compete with Tracy and decided to back down. Chapter 4. It wasn't until I stepped into the elevator that I let out a long breath. I've poured all my emotions into these past 3 years, but in the end, it didn't yield a happy ending. Faint breathing sounds echoed in my ears. My thoughts returned, and I realized that the man in the elevator with me was Joseph. His face was flushed, cold sweat was dripping from his forehead, and he was leaning heavily against the elevator wall, breathing heavily, seemingly unwell. Instinctively, I wanted to help him but hesitated, sensing that something wasn't right about his condition. What happened to him? It didn't seem like he was sick. Joseph glanced at me. Do me a favor, help me to the underground parking lot. I hesitated for a moment, but seeing his pained expression, I eventually agreed, okay. I slowly moved closer, draped his arm over my shoulder, and supported him out of the elevator when it reached the basement level. He was burning hot, even his breath was scorching. Where's your car parked? He softly mentioned a location, and his warm breath brushed against my sensitive neck, making me uncomfortable and eager to set him down as quickly as possible. Just then, Louis and his group emerged from the elevator. Instinctively, I pulled Joseph behind a pillar to hide. Joseph's body seemed unusually limp, and he let out a low moan, pressing against me. Wait, Louis, look over there, it looks like Joseph. And it seems like there's a woman under him. No way, is he so desperate that he's doing it in a parking lot? Should we go check? My entire body tensed up, not because I still cared about what Louis thought, but because the situation was just too embarrassing. As if things weren't chaotic enough, Joseph leaned close to my ear, his breath hot. What do you think Louis would do if he saw this? I glared at him. His fingers lightly traced my waist, slowly inching upward. He's always been possessive about you, never allowing another man to even touch your clothes. If he saw me like this with you, I bet he'd be furious. The footsteps grew closer, and in a panic, I grabbed his hand. My scalp tingled. Joseph's eyes were filled with amusement. You seemed so heartbroken in the elevator earlier. Have you already broken up with Louis? I whispered, what if I have? But then, he suddenly smiled, his eyes shining brightly, glistening with water. Forget it. Louis's cold voice echoed. Tracy and I have things to do, let's go. Chapter 5. After they left, Joseph finally let go of me. I stepped back to calm myself, feeling a bit annoyed. You seem perfectly fine. You didn't need my help at all. I was drugged. Drugged. By a female boss from H City. After I rejected her a few times, she got angry. He exhaled, his gaze playful as he looked at me. Don't worry, unlike Lewis, even under the influence of drugs, I can control myself. I gritted my teeth. Then why did you? You got so close. I couldn't help myself. I glared at him, recalling what he had said earlier, feeling a bit surprised. You already knew about Lewis and Tracy. So, in the end, I was the last to know. A friend told me tonight. They spotted him and Tracy checking into a hotel. He studied my expression. With your personality, I figured you wouldn't just let it go. I lowered my head, and after a long silence, I finally spoke, yes. 3 years. Even if it started out of guilt. These 3 years, with countless mornings and nights spent together, experiencing so many ups and downs, almost made me believe that we were in love. The feeling of being betrayed after giving your heart is not a pleasant one. Joseph gently patted my head, his voice soft. All right, don't be sad. If you start crying later, people might think I bullied you. His attempt at comfort only made me feel more upset. My nose tingled, and with a hoarse voice, I asked him, do you have a tissue? Joseph was momentarily stunned, his gaze darkening for a second. Yes. He handed me a tissue, whispering softly, if the timing were different, and the setting were different. Tears filled my eyes as I looked up at him. What? Due to the nasal congestion and the sense of grievance, her voice trembled slightly. Joseph's throat bobbed as he covered his eyes. It's all because of this damn medicine. I suddenly understood what he meant and awkwardly took a step back. Do you want me to take you to the hospital? He seemed to smile. Silly, I'll be fine after a while. Oh. Or you could just say something random to distract me. What did you have for dinner? He was speechless. Ask something more meaningful. Then. What was the first thing you did after your eyesight was restored 3 years ago? I asked curiously. Joseph's expression suddenly turned serious. I found you and looked at your face. I was taken aback, not expecting that answer. 3 years ago, Joseph was in a car accident that left him blind, and I was the nurse who took care of him. Were you disappointed? I smiled, trying to ease the awkwardness. He shook his head. I didn't have high expectations for your appearance, but you exceeded them. I couldn't tell if that was a compliment or an insult, so I touched my face. It should be a compliment. Although you had a bad temper at first and treated me roughly, I understood. Anyone would find it hard to accept suddenly becoming blind. I smiled at him. So, when your sight was restored, I was genuinely happy for you. He gazed at me for a moment, his eyes softening. Yes, when I first saw you, you were smiling at me like that. I softly murmured in agreement. But not long after, you handed me your resignation letter, saying you had to take care of your injured boyfriend from the accident. Joseph's tone became indifferent. I can't believe a guy like that could be your boyfriend. All along, everyone thought I wasn't good enough for Lewis. It was the first time someone said something like that to me. Speaking of which, since you've broken up with him, you shouldn't have to run around for him anymore, he said seriously. Are you interested in being a curator at my gallery? I've always trusted your taste. I was slightly taken aback. Susie, you know my feelings well, and I've never hidden them. Joseph leaned against a column, tilting his head to look at me. But this job offer isn't just because of my personal feelings. I believe in your abilities. Chapter 6. Half a year ago, my mother passed away after a serious illness. While it was heartbreaking, it also meant I no longer had to worry about the high medical bills. Besides, I desperately needed a job to pay off the debts I had accumulated. After hesitating for a while and seeing the overdue payment reminders on my phone, I finally contacted Joseph. Having worked as Lewis's assistant and manager for 3 years, attending countless art exhibitions and auctions, I had developed my own taste and art appreciation skills. Plus, I was familiar with the industry, so I adapted fairly well over the next few days. Close to the end of the day, Joseph knocked on my desk. "Since I helped you out, how about treating me to a meal?" Speaking of which, Joseph had helped me more than once. A year ago, when my mom's condition was critical, she needed a major brain tumor removal surgery. The tumor was large and located deep in her brain, making the surgery extremely risky. There were only a handful of doctors in the country who could perform such surgeries, and getting an appointment was nearly impossible. When I was at my wit's end, Joseph helped me secure a doctor and arranged everything from pre-surgery preparation to post-surgery recovery. Knowingly, I owed him a lot of favors. "I really should thank you properly," I smiled at him. "What do you want to eat? You pick the place." Joseph smiled. "All right." He took me to a cozy music restaurant where a band performed every night. What I didn't expect was to run into Louis and Tracy there. Look, it didn't take long for her to show up and try to make her presence known. Louis was right, she couldn't hold out for long. Louis is the best she can do. She must have made quite a bit from selling his paintings over the years. What woman would give that up? Louis leaned back in his chair, looking at me with a half-smile. Hearing his friends openly gossiping, my body stiffened. Joseph returned from parking the car and gently placed his hand on my shoulder, asking softly, "What's wrong? Can't find a seat." Chapter 7. I felt a sense of relief. Yeah. Louis did help me a lot financially. I took care of his daily needs, arranged gallery exhibitions for him, and he would give me a commission for every painting sold. At first, I didn't want to accept it. But with the large debt my parents left behind, I needed to keep working to pay it off, which meant I had less and less time to spend with Louis. After a while, he became increasingly dissatisfied. Instead of going out to earn that little bit of money, why not stay by my side as my assistant? "I've told you, I can't create anything when you're not around. The money I give you should be much more than what you earn tutoring outside." Over those 3 years, my debt significantly decreased, and I was very grateful to him. Maybe in Louis's mind, I was only helping him get back to painting because of the money. The waiter led us to our table, and Joseph, being a gentleman, pulled out my chair for me. Unfortunately, our table was right next to theirs. As the waiter set down the menu and turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of Tracy picking up Louis's wine glass and taking a sip. She smiled, probably commenting on how good the wine was. Louis had severe germophobia and hated anyone touching his personal belongings, let alone sharing utensils. Tracy was the only one who could touch him, and the only one who could share the same glass with him. I remembered accidentally drinking from his glass before, and his face immediately darkened. I hurriedly apologized, but he simply threw the glass away. Even though it had once been his favorite glass. Now Tracy had done the same thing, and instead of being annoyed, he looked at her indulgently. Everyone knew that Tracy was Louis's muse, and all of his paintings before he turned 20 were made for her, each one expressing his love for her. Before this, my understanding of Tracy only existed in my imagination. Now, I truly saw how special she was to Louis. Chapter 8. Joseph's voice brought me back to reality. "Would you like to have a drink tonight?" I paused for a moment. I have a very low tolerance for alcohol, one drink is enough to knock me out. Plus, when I'm drunk, I tend to get a bit handsy. So unless I'm with close friends, I usually avoid drinking. "Today is my birthday," Joseph said. "Is that so?" I smiled apologetically, glancing around. "Is it just the two of us?" In previous years, Joseph's birthday parties were always grand affairs. He gave a faint smile. "I couldn't be bothered to entertain others, I just wanted to spend it with you." My heart skipped a beat. It's rare for someone to treat me so openly with such special attention, and I didn't know how to respond. I lowered my head and awkwardly muttered, "Okay." As the band played softly in the background, I unknowingly finished my first drink, and Joseph naturally refilled my glass. I quickly refused. I really can't drink anymore. My tolerance is terrible. "This is fruit wine, very low in alcohol," he said. "Are you feeling okay right now?" Aside from feeling a bit warm, my head wasn't spinning too much. Since it was his birthday, I nodded and didn't stop him. Suddenly, the sharp clatter of metal utensils against a plate startled me. I turned to look and met Louis's angry eyes. "Ignore him. Joseph swapped his steak plate with mine. I heard this is Wagyu beef flown in from Australia, it's incredibly tender. Give it a try. Oh, okay. I forced myself to focus, spearing a piece of meat and putting it in my mouth. I couldn't help but smile at him, it really is delicious. He gently patted my head and smiled too, I'm glad you like it. Maybe the fruit wine was really as low in alcohol as he said because after 2 glasses, I still felt quite clear-headed. However, my heart was racing, and I couldn't help but find Joseph's eyes a bit mesmerizing. I need to use the restroom, I said, my voice soft and light. He nodded but cautioned, you're a bit drunk. Let me ask a female server to accompany you. I shook my head, placing the napkin back on the table as I stood up. But my body swayed a bit. Are you okay? Joseph stood up and supported me. At some point, Louis had appeared behind us. He angrily knocked Joseph's hand away from my waist, don't touch her. He rejected my closeness, even finding it repulsive to touch my hand, yet he wouldn't allow another man near me. Knowing this about him in the past, I always made sure to keep my distance from other men. But now, we had broken up. A faint anger rose in my chest. Since we were in a public place, I didn't want to make a scene, let's ask the server to change our table. Joseph agreed softly, all right. In comparison, Joseph seemed much more reasonable. Louis looked at me in disbelief, Susie. He probably didn't expect me to embarrass him like this. I ignored him and headed to the restroom. Chapter 9. When I returned to the restaurant, the server had already moved us to a corner table near the wall. I'm sorry I didn't prepare a gift and even spoiled your mood. I apologized to Joseph. He smiled and gestured with his chin behind me, I don't think you spoiled my mood. I followed his gaze and saw that Louis was still staring at me, his eyes cold. Joseph curved his lips, let me show you something interesting. He propped himself on the table and leaned in, gently pressing a kiss on my lips. Damn. In the midst of the slightly noisy music, Louis cursed and quickly walked over, yanking Joseph away and landing a punch on his face. Who the hell told you to kiss her? Joseph didn't hold back either, grabbing Louis by the collar and punching him back. The restaurant manager hurried over to break up the fight. I quickly stepped in front of Joseph. Blood was already seeping from the corner of his mouth, and his cheek was swollen. Seeing me protect Joseph, Louis became even angrier and wanted to hit him again, but I stopped him. If you touch him again, I'll call the police. Louis gritted his teeth, are you heartbroken? I could no longer hold back. We broke up a long time ago. There's a limit to how much you can lose your mind. He panted heavily, glaring at me. Tracy walked over and gently pulled him back. There was a clear look of shock on her face, but she kept her emotions in check as she softly persuaded him, Louis, let's go. I helped Joseph leave. What good is that blind man? Louis spat out harsh and ugly words. But I guess you two are a perfect match. I calmly responded, thank you. His expression darkened completely. Chapter 10. I bought some medicine at a nearby pharmacy and treated his wounds in the car. Does it hurt? I pressed an ice pack against the swelling on his face. He nodded. I whispered, serves you right. Was that your first kiss? I glared at him, pursing my lips in silence. But he just laughed, looking smug, that punch was worth it. I threw the ice pack at him and pretended to get out of the car. Looks like you're not in much pain after all. It's getting late, so I'll head home now. He quickly grabbed my hand, and the smile tugged at the wound on his lips, causing him to hiss in pain. Don't be mad. I was wrong. He held my hand, conceding, there's still 2 hours left until midnight, and I haven't had any cake yet. Joseph's behavior reminded me of 3 years ago. After we became acquainted, he was also like this, completely changing from his initial cold and distant demeanor. When he felt wronged, he would sulk at me, and when he made mistakes, he would take the initiative to soothe me. In this way, I felt much closer to him. Should I go buy you a cake? He smiled, sure. After buying the cake, he suggested, do you want to go back to the place where you took care of me? His words surprised me. I thought he would despise that place. After all, it held many of his painful memories. Okay. Unexpectedly, the apartment was very clean, and the layout and furnishings remained the same as before. Joseph put down the cake and led me directly to a room. The moment the door opened, my heart trembled. What greeted my eyes were numerous Winnie the Pooh plush toys, neatly arranged on the bed and on a lace-covered table. I've kept all of these. After Joseph's car accident, a blood clot in his brain compressed his optic nerve, resulting in temporary blindness. The doctor said it would take about 3 to 5 months for the brain to absorb the blood clot. If his vision didn't recover after that, it would be more problematic. At first, Joseph couldn't adapt to the darkness and became particularly irritable. He would sweep everything he could touch to the ground, refuse to eat, and refuse to use a wheelchair. He would rather stumble and bruise himself than let me help him. He drove away 3 or 4 caregivers in a row, and I was the only one who stayed. Because I couldn't trust him to bathe alone, I had to turn my back and wait in the bathroom, always on alert in case he fell. One time, while dressing, he accidentally dropped his towel and bent down to search for it, only to hit his head on the sink, crying out in pain. I quickly turned around to check on him, and what I wasn't supposed to see came into view. I felt a rush of heat. He gave up trying to dress himself and let me help him. I had never been so intimately close to a young man before. My whole body went numb as I blushed and helped him put on his pants. "Why are you trembling?" he mocked. "Never seen a man before?" By then, I was used to his sarcastic remarks. For the sake of the money, I didn't get too upset. Besides, he did have a nice body. Over time, I noticed that Joseph kept a Winnie the Pooh toy by his bedside. He cherished it deeply and wouldn't let anyone but himself touch it. Given his personality, it seemed out of character for him to be so sentimental. One day, I asked about it casually. I expected Joseph to brush me off like before, but after a moment of silence, he began to talk about his past. "When I was 8, my mom gave me this toy and told me she had recorded her voice inside. She said whenever I missed her, I just needed to press the button, and she'd come back soon. But even after the toy broke and stopped making sound, she never returned. Later, I found out she had heart problems. She left to have surgery, but it failed. Do you know why I kept you around?" I was taken aback. "Why?" A faint smile appeared on his lips. "Because your voice reminds me of her." To cheer Joseph up, I did something very much like a K-drama heroine. Every day, I gave him a small bear toy with a recorded message of encouragement. "When you collect 100 of these, you'll be able to see again." When he received the first one, he resumed his usual mockery. "Do you think you're in a drama?" I felt a bit awkward. "I used my own money to buy these. If they work, you should reimburse me." He held the toy, head lowered, lost in thought. After a while, he let out a soft chuckle. Unfortunately, 3 months passed, and Joseph still hadn't regained his sight. A follow-up at the hospital revealed that his optic nerve had slightly atrophied, and it would take some time to recover. This time, his reaction was much calmer than before. He quietly let me push him back home. A year later, I was out buying groceries when a sudden rainstorm hit. Worried about leaving Joseph alone, I hurried back. For a long time, no rides accepted my request on the app. Finally, I flagged down a taxi, and only after I got in did I realize someone else was already inside. And that someone was Louis. He was a painter who had gained fame at a young age, with looks rivaling popular idols. He had many female fans online. The driver chuckled, "This handsome guy couldn't stand to see you in the rain, so he asked me to pick you up." I was stunned and quickly thanked him. But Louis only glanced at me briefly when I got in and said nothing afterward. Later, the taxi rear-ended a truck, and we both got injured. To protect my face, Louis ended up with glass shards piercing his hand. This accident was what bound our fates together, even though we had no prior connection. I later learned that Louis had the driver pick me up because my outfit resembled Tracy's. After the accident, I asked Joseph for leave, not wanting to worry him, so I didn't mention my injury. Sometime later, I received a call from him. Joseph's voice was filled with joy. "Susie, I can see again." I was genuinely happy for him. "That's great." He asked where I was, saying he wanted to come see me. I hesitated for a moment and then, apologetically, said, "Now that you've regained your sight, my job is done. I've been meaning to resign." He clearly didn't expect my response. After a brief silence, he asked, "Why? Do you know Louis? He's a painter. A while ago, we were in a car accident, and he hurt his right hand protecting me. I need to take care of him. If you don't have time, you can just tell me over the phone." He took a shallow breath. "I like you." I was stunned, and after a long pause, I replied, "But I already promised to be his girlfriend." Chapter 11. We missed each other just like that. After you left, these teddy bears kept me company through many dull nights. He casually picked up a bear, pressed a button, and the bear waved its arms while my slightly embarrassed voice played. "Joseph, you are an amazing person. Believe in yourself. You can do it." I felt like digging a hole and burying myself. Every time I hear this, I can imagine you, all flustered, recording this with the bear. He smiled. It never fails to lift my mood. Isn't it because of my heartfelt encouragement? He didn't deny it. Yes. I looked at him. "Susie, you radiate warmth." He leaned in to hug me, sighing softly. "That's why. People like us are drawn to you. During the darkest, most painful times, it was thinking of you that gave me the courage to open my eyes the next morning. I regret not telling you my feelings sooner. Susie, I've waited for you for 3 years. Can you give me a chance?" Maybe it was the lingering alcohol in my system, or perhaps his words stirred something in my heart. The soft lighting above softened Joseph's features, making his eyes appear especially tender. I stood on tiptoe and kissed him on the lips. He froze. Gently, feeling a bit wronged, I asked, "Kissing me isn't that awful, right?" Louis rejected me for 3 years, yet on Tracy's first day back, he slept with her. Just because I don't show it doesn't mean I don't feel hurt. Joseph held me tightly, answering my words with his body. His kiss was more eager and awkward than mine. Chapter 12. After Joseph approved the exhibition's theme, I began the preparations. First, I secured the venue, arranged the lighting and setup, and upon learning that a renowned Japanese artist was coming to the country, I made great efforts to get in touch with his team. The artist had never authorized his work in the country before. To secure the first opportunity, I flew to his city. From my understanding of his work and my admiration for him, to how his art aligned with my theme, I presented my utmost sincerity. He said he would seriously consider it and get back to us later. I wasn't sure if this was a polite refusal or if he was genuinely considering it. I couldn't place all my hopes on this one master. As I traveled around negotiating with other artists, Louis sent over a painting. It was a portrait of Tracy, someone I had never seen before. Beautiful, pure, and translucent. Her eyes seemed to hold the summer night's rain, a cool rain tinged with summer's humidity and restlessness, of which she was unaware. The painting was titled Night Dew. So this is how Tracy looks through his eyes. The purpose of sending this painting was clear, to provoke me. After all, in those 3 years, Louis never painted a single portrait of me. Given Louis' fame, his work would undoubtedly add prestige to my exhibition. I had no reason to refuse. But Louis knew I wouldn't refuse, and that made him angry. He called to confront me, his voice suppressed with inexplicable anger. "Are you really that desperate for money? You know I've always needed money." I chuckled, my gaze drifting to the painting. I should thank Louis on behalf of the gallery for the generous donation. Louis truly is a genius. The way he captured Tracy's fragile beauty will surely fetch a satisfying price. The heavy breathing on the other end of the line grew louder, and after a long silence, I almost thought he'd hung up. "Fine. In exchange for this painting, you do something for me. That's fair, right?" He suddenly said. "What is it?" "You'll know when we meet." Chapter 13. Louis invited me to his studio. I hadn't been here in a long time, and it was much messier than I expected. Louis sat in front of his easel, his eyes bloodshot. Many torn or crumpled drawings littered the floor, along with spilled paint. It was clear that his recent work hadn't gone smoothly. This surprised me. I thought that after Tracy returned, he'd find his muse again and be brimming with inspiration. "What do you want me to do?" He glanced at me, silent for a long time. His gaze seemed to look through me. I stepped closer, but he said, "Do what you usually do." Huh? It took me a couple of seconds to realize what he meant. He wanted me to keep him company while he painted, just like before. I hesitated for a moment, then knelt down to clean up the messy floor for him. In the past, when he was working, I wouldn't interfere much. I'd quietly do my own thing. Time passed slowly, and for a moment, it felt like those 3 years all over again. We were there for each other, leaning on each other. Sensing that he was almost done, I wanted to glance at his work, but Louis stopped me. "Turn around. No peeking." "Fine. My birthday is in 3 days," he said quietly. "You promised you'd stay with me and celebrate." I did promise him that. But he never remembered my birthday. Last time, Tracy just happened to return. The outcome was obvious. He seemed to remember that incident too. After a long silence, he spoke softly. "If you come, I will make it up to you with a gift." Chapter 14. When I got home, I found Joseph waiting for me. "Went to see him?" "Yes." He was silent for a moment, then asked, "How did it go?" I thought he was asking about work. "Louis has agreed to authorize his painting for us." Joseph paused. "That's good." 3 days quickly passed. The preparations for the exhibition were nearly complete. I finally received a response from the Japanese master, who agreed to grant us authorization. I was overjoyed. I dressed up, putting on a dress I rarely wore. The neckline was very low, a bit too revealing. I hesitated, thinking Joseph would like it, so I couldn't bear to take it off. I opened the door and slowly stood in front of Joseph. Not used to dressing like this, I awkwardly covered my chest. A glimmer of admiration flashed in Joseph's eyes. I was secretly pleased. He glanced at me a few times, his brow furrowing slightly. "Put your hands down." My ears burned as I nervously let go. His gaze fell on me, and he pressed his lips together. Contrary to my expectations, he didn't look happy. "Are you really planning to wear this? Is that not okay?" His expression darkened further. "Of course not." I lowered my head and glanced at myself. Was he thinking I looked too inappropriate? Why? I felt a bit disheartened. What man would want his girlfriend to dress like this to meet other men? Joseph said sullenly. "I'm not planning to meet any other men." Joseph was stunned. "Aren't you going to Louis' birthday party?" So, that's why he was upset. "I'm not going to his birthday party." I looked into his eyes and softly said, "The Japanese master agreed, and he even said he'd attend in person." Joseph once said that if the master himself could come, then the exhibition would already be half successful. His expression changed slightly. "I'm really happy, and I appreciate everything you've done for me," I said. "So, I made a reservation at a fancy restaurant to treat you to a nice dinner." Joseph's ears turned a little red. "Oh. You misunderstood. I see. So. Will you go?" His gaze slowly swept over me, then stayed still. The temperature around us gradually rose. "Well, let's head out now." I blushed under his gaze and prepared to walk out. He stopped me. "We don't need to go to a fancy restaurant." His voice was a bit hoarse. "There's something else I'm more interested in right now." Chapter 15. During my 3 years with Louis, even the slightest touch of our fingers would annoy him. But now, Joseph was holding me, his slightly heated kisses falling on my skin. It was such an unfamiliar feeling. The air seemed to become sticky, my vision hazy, unable to see clearly. It was embarrassing, shameful. I didn't want him to see. But my heart tightened. My phone vibrated beside my ear. No time to pay attention to it. Again and again, it persisted. Finally, Joseph picked it up, stared at it for half a second, pressed a button, and tossed it aside. So fast. His face darkened. "This time doesn't count." I hugged him, my face flushed as I murmured. "It's okay, Joseph, I'm also. This is my first time too." Bang! A crashing sound came from the phone, followed by the heavy breathing of a furious man. "If you dare touch her, I'll kill you." It was Louis. Joseph hung up the phone. Let's continue. Chapter 16. It wasn't until noon the next day that I woke up from extreme exhaustion. After turning on my phone, I saw that Louis had called me over 100 times. I vaguely recalled what had happened last night. He heard everything. But it doesn't matter anymore. Struggling to get out of bed, I found Joseph in the kitchen making porridge. The sunlight fell on his face, highlighting his handsome features. Barefoot, I walked over and leaned against him, unable to resist asking the question that had bothered me last night. Considering your age, shouldn't you? He clearly understood what I meant, and he awkwardly turned his head away. Didn't you say you don't like things that others have touched? I felt a stir in my heart and wrapped my arms around his waist. This fool. He really waited for me for 3 years. After dinner, we tidied up a bit and prepared to go to my place to pick up some things. But I didn't expect to see Louis at my doorstep. He must have waited all night. His eyes were dark and sunken, looking disheveled and exhausted. His hands seemed injured, staining his fingers red, and there was a dried pool of blood on the ground, looking rather unsettling. He glanced at Joseph, then fixed his gaze on me. It seemed he noticed the hickey on my neck. His eyes darkened, and his injured hand trembled slightly. You too? Did it last night? He asked. Yes, Joseph replied, pulling me close, his voice low, as if savoring the memory. Susie is really soft. Violence flashed in Louis's eyes. Joseph planted a tender kiss on me. I should thank you. You kept her chaste for 3 years. Even Susie's first kiss was mine. The veins on Louis's forehead bulged, and his eyes turned completely red. Touch her again, and I'll kill you. Before I could react, Joseph was knocked to the ground by him. So what if I did? I did much more than just kiss her, Joseph said, blood seeping from the corner of his mouth, but he seemed unfazed, still smirking. She was so inexperienced, she didn't dare open her eyes. Just touching any part of her skin made her tremble. But none of that concerns you anymore. Louis was completely enraged and started fighting with Joseph. I tried to stop them but couldn't, so I called the police. When the police arrived, they finally stopped. What makes you think you can compare with me? Joseph's eye was bruised, and he was panting heavily, but he looked proud. Susie has a cleanliness obsession. I've never been with another woman. But you? Joseph cast a disdainful look at him. You're too dirty. Louis's face turned ashen. Chapter 17. With me as a witness, confirming that Louis had attacked first and that Joseph was merely defending himself, Louis ended up being detained for 7 days for fighting. Joseph was quite injured, but his mood was rather cheerful. At least Louis's taste isn't completely terrible. He could see that we were well matched. This was what Louis had said when we left the restaurant after their last punch-up. Joseph had remembered it all this time. I couldn't help but feel a bit helpless. Luckily, there was still some time before the exhibition opening. Otherwise, facing the media with his face like that would surely become fodder for the gossip mill. A few days later, Louis called me. You're out? I asked. He was silent for a moment. The painting I gave you has a problem. It needs to be revised. You're talking about Night Dew? Yes. This is a piece from 5 years ago. You're revising it now? Yes. I took a deep breath. I'll have my assistant send the painting to your place. No need, he said, I'll come to your gallery. Louis arrived. The bruises on his face had faded slightly, his hands still wrapped in bandages, and he looked noticeably thinner. I led him to the office, where a painting stand and paints were prepared. Feel free to work here. No one will disturb you. After saying this, I prepared to leave. But he stopped me. Louis grabbed my hand. I froze. He rarely touched me directly. In the past, he avoided contact with any woman besides Tracy. I tried to pull my hand away, but he held it tightly. What's wrong? Louis took a step closer, pressing me against the door. His eyes were tinged with red as if he was holding back emotions. He leaned in close. Isn't this what you wanted? Soft lips touched mine. His eyelashes trembled slightly, and he deepened the kiss. Susie. I was too startled to dodge, and he pried open my lips and teeth, making me struggle. His scent filled me, his smooth tongue entwining with mine. The taste was sweet. His eyes darkened, and his other hand rested on my waist. Tears welled up in my eyes. The intimacy I once craved now only made me feel disgusted. I clenched my teeth and bit down hard. Louis recoiled in pain, glaring at me. "Get out." I was furious. "You're insane." He must have tasted blood, gritting his teeth as he swallowed. "He can, but I can't." Yes, I was so mad I could barely think. "He can. You can't. You lied about needing to revise the painting, and instead, you do this." Louis's chest heaved violently, then he spoke slowly. "What if I told you I never slept with Tracy?" I stared into his eyes. "Whether you did or didn't. In my eyes, you're already dirty." Chapter 18. The art exhibition opened as scheduled. Because we had invited a well-known Japanese artist, it attracted a large crowd of art enthusiasts and media, making it far more successful than I had anticipated. At the evening banquet, Louis also attended. People around him continued to greet and chat, but he remained indifferent and did not respond. Seeing that he was not interested, others gradually dispersed, and Louis walked up to me. The look in his eyes was complex, filled with emotions I couldn't decipher. "Congratulations," he said. I stayed silent, then smiled and raised my glass towards him. "Congratulations to you too, Louis." Night Dew fetched a high price. In the end, he did change that painting. On the day before leaving, he dipped his hand into red paint, caressed the painting, and smeared Tracy's face. Yet, this stroke added a new layer of meaning. Beneath the girl's pure image, her eyes held jealous redness, her face marked with desires. Louis hesitated for a moment, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Can you spare some time for me after the banquet ends? I have something to tell you." Before I could reply, Joseph led me to a prominent figure in the business world, smiling as he introduced me. I wasn't good with alcohol, and today was no exception. By the time the banquet ended, I was already feeling dizzy. On the way home, I rolled down the car window, letting the city's scent flow in with the evening breeze, dispersing some of the alcohol fumes. In fact, before today, I was anxious all along, afraid that I wouldn't do well, afraid that the exhibition would flop, disappointing your expectations, I stuttered. "You did great, even exceeding my expectations," Joseph comforted in a low voice. "Your performance today has turned you into a walking business card. More people will discover your brilliance in the future." My nose tingled, trying to hide it. I jokingly asked, "Does that mean I'm going to get rich?" He chuckled, "Yes." I rested my head on his shoulder. "Thank you, Joseph." Chapter 19. At my wedding with Joseph, I saw the painting Louis had called me over to his house to see that day. It turned out to be a painting of me. In the painting, I was wearing a green dress, leaning down, patiently advising him on painting with his left hand. He looked peaceful, with a smile on his lips, showing a close and dependent relationship with me. On the floor were crumpled paper balls and spilled paint, the bandage on the painter's right hand mostly removed, revealing a perfectly unharmed hand. The soft morning light shone through the window, illuminating his left hand holding the paintbrush with determination. The painting was titled "Left Hand. I have lost my left hand forever." On the same day, Louis announced his retirement from the art world.
Louis' side story. Tracy returned. She called him, asking if he would pick her up at the airport. He hesitated. Susie was waiting for him at home to celebrate her birthday. In the past 2 years, he had forgotten everything. But this time, somehow he remembered. Tracy sensed his hesitation, her tone becoming softer. "Louis, it's been so long, I miss you a lot." He stayed silent, then said, "Okay." It wasn't that he couldn't see through her tricks. It was just that, no matter what she said, he was still willing to believe. He went to meet her. In the restaurant, she was drunk, her eyes red, tears falling drop by drop. She said, "Louis, I divorced him." She said, "What I was pursuing turned out to be just my own illusion." He escorted her to the hotel. As the door opened, she hugged his neck, her voice choked up. "Now that I'm back, is it too late?" He looked down at her. In his mind flashed the summer 10 years ago, filled with cicada cries and sultriness. A young him pushed open the bedroom door, only to see intertwined bodies of a man and a woman, naked, loathsome, and disgusting. Even the air carried a foul stench. And his mother's flushed cheeks, and the man's twisted face. She was having an affair with his uncle. He remembered vomiting. He fell ill for a long time, with a relentless high fever and continuous nightmares. At this time, Tracy told him that her father was also having an affair. Her mother was heartbroken, crying every day. She hated her father so much, and felt sorry for her mother. If it were me, I would never do anything to hurt my family. Me too, he said. Because of this statement, they decided to be together. To be the person who would never betray each other. Tracy became his muse. His only muse. She was a pure land in his heart. But later on, she fell in love with his brother. They kissed in secret, their lips and tongues entwined, as if the nightmare of adolescence was replaying. She was panicked, but did not explain. After that, he found himself unable to paint. No matter how hard he tried, all he could see in his mind were the images of his mother's affair, alternating with scenes of Tracy entangled with his brother. He tore up the painting paper and threw it into the trash, trembling all over. Later, he met Susie. In a car accident, his right hand was injured. The girl felt extremely guilty about this and asked him if there was any way she could make it up to him. After learning about his injury, Tracy left an apology letter and resolutely followed his brother abroad. Soon, news of their marriage arrived. He sarcastically smirked, "I lack nothing, just missing a woman." From then on, Susie became his girlfriend. But she was ultimately just a substitute. A substitute for when Tracy wasn't around. Coming back to reality, he looked at the Tracy in front of him. She was still very beautiful, 3 years had passed, and she hadn't changed a bit. He loved Tracy. It was as if this was an obsession deeply rooted in his bones. He knew very well that he couldn't let her go. Closing his eyes, he slowly embraced her. "I have been waiting for you." Tracy, under the influence of alcohol, kissed him. They fell onto the bed. There was no yearning or passion of a long-awaited reunion as imagined. Faced with her intimacy, he felt somewhat uncomfortable, something he had never experienced before. He held Tracy, kissed her forehead. "Give me a little more time." In the bar, a few friends discussed the past between him and Tracy. This was a welcoming party prepared for Tracy's return. Only Susie was unaware. Looking at the hickey on his neck, Susie understood everything. He did not expect her to decisively break up with him like this. She said she wouldn't take something that had been used before. At that moment, his heart suddenly tightened, a hint of pain and confusion surged through. Clearly, Susie was just a temporary substitute for Tracy's absence. Since she was a tool, there was no need to care about her thoughts and feelings. He ignored that strange feeling in his heart. Tracy came back. Everything should have been able to return to how it was before. But he still couldn't paint with his right hand. Tracy leaned on his shoulder, a smile on her lips, softly chatting about the beautiful memories they once had. It should have been a very heartwarming scene, but in his mind appeared the expression of that girl looking at him, her breath when she crouched beside him, the soft comfort and encouragement. Her hand was very soft, with an inexplicable fragrance, holding his left hand to help him pick up the brush, and somehow he didn't refuse. Her lips were soft, shining with a glossy pink. His breathing became somewhat heavy. The kiss should have been very sweet. It was a desire that originated from the bottom of his heart. Initially, this kind of thought only occasionally surfaced. And every time it appeared, he would disdain it. Having witnessed his mother's affair firsthand, having seen her scenes with his uncle, he developed a strong aversion and disgust towards sex. Even ordinary physical contact with women made him repulsed. When did he start having such strange thoughts about Susie? As time passed, it became increasingly difficult to suppress. A week later, he met Susie at a restaurant. What made him unhappy was that Joseph was standing beside her. That man never concealed his affection for her. They had only been apart for a short while, yet he eagerly clung to her. Joseph touched her waist, knowing she had a low alcohol tolerance, and kept pouring her drinks. The foolish Susie was completely unaware. For some reason, he found it very annoying and wanted to cut off the hand Joseph had placed on her waist, so he would never dare to touch her again. Soon, something happened that made him even angrier. Joseph kissed her. He hadn't even kissed Susie yet. How dare Joseph? Intense anger surged through him, causing him to lose his rationality in an instant. By the time he came to his senses, Susie was already standing in front of Joseph. He heard his own voice mixed with jealousy. "What's so good about this blind man? But you two seem to match." Susie said, "Thank you." Hearing these words, his heart felt a sudden pang of pain. Tracy had already returned to his side. Yet he couldn't paint anything anymore. Just returning to that studio, sitting in front of the easel, a surge of emotions overwhelmed him, anxious, chaotic. When he looked up, when he lowered his head, that woman's figure was everywhere. Even if he closed his eyes, she would still appear in his mind. Standing in a messy studio, Tracy cried on the side. He suddenly realized. He cared much more about that woman than he had imagined. What followed gradually spiraled out of control. On his birthday, he waited for her alone in the studio all day, wanting to give her that painting. It was a portrait he had painted for her. From day to night, she didn't come. He called her, but heard ambiguous gasps of a man and a woman on the other end. He had never heard her voice so soft and captivating. "Joseph, this is my first time too." The call was disconnected, but he knew the person on the other end was still continuing. Various sensual images kept floating in his mind. Susie's eyes filled with watery hues, her lips, her shoulders, her. Those uncharted territories he had never explored were being continuously claimed and invaded by other men. A sweet metallic taste rose in his throat as he looked at the glass shards deeply embedded in his palm. He knew this time, Susie wouldn't care anymore. He went to find Susie. How ridiculous. Now, he had to rely on Tracy's portrait just to have a chance to meet her. He wanted to tell her that he had overcome his demons. That he wouldn't be the same towards her as before, that his feelings for Tracy were just a youthful infatuation and obsession. Only now did he realize she was never the person he had imagined. He wanted to say, "Susie, I love you." But Susie's expression was so disdainful. She said, "Louis, you are already filthy in my eyes." Later, he slowly understood. Susie and Joseph were happy together, very happy. Much happier than when she was with him. Unlike him, Joseph had the ability to love, to help Susie become a better version of herself. Indeed, Joseph was much better than him. And he could no longer find someone who could inspire him to paint with his left hand. He had lost his left hand long ago.